Okay. Alrighty, so let's get started here. So we were talking about stuff. We were talking about stuff. All right, so we're talking about youth and religion, right? Last time we talked a little bit about kind of some of the landscape stuff, what's happening in terms of the growth of one particular kind of, we would call them a religious group, but really they're defined by, saying that they have no religion, right? No religion or nothing in particular, or whatever it happens to be, concentrated amongst millennials and Gen Z. And then we went through a little bit of the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion about what the millennials were like when they were teenagers. We're going to talk about emerging adults today in terms of their religious belief. And of course, we spent a good bit of time on this concept of moralistic therapeutic deism, right? MTD, which Smith and Denton suggested is sorry, a little bit of a headache, fighting through a migraine today, which is, or was, the dominant sort of religious system of millennials when they were in their teens and then, in their emerging adult years as well. And right, this system is all about feeling good, feeling happy, and basically using religion as a tool to that end, right? So that religion becomes just another tool in the therapeutic toolbox. And then we were talking about our the 9 culture. Oh, sorry. Then we went through some stats, looking at sort of differences in terms of life outcomes for our different kind of gradients of religious young people, right? From those who are very devoted, just a small percent, all the way to those who are disengaged from religion, and just kind of noting that there are substantial differences across a whole bunch of measures of outcomes for young people that we should care about, right? Including things like risk behaviors, quality of personal relationships, body image, and I can't remember the other ones. But across all of these measures, right, there's meaningful differences between those who are religiously engaged and those who are religiously disengaged, where the religiously engaged seem to have more positive life outcomes than the disengaged. Now, Smith and Denton then put this down to our 9 cultural factors, right? And as I noted, only a couple of these are potentially actually really related directly to religion. The rest of them really are more related to community, right? All of these have to do with community. And I think what, I'll talk about, we got through up to here on Monday, so we're going to continue from there. But what I think is worth noting is none of this, or not none of this, but very little of this actually has to do with community. But one of the things we're going to see, especially as we go in, we've already kind of seen it a little bit with Jean Twenge's kind of talking about where young people spend their time. We're going to look at that even more as we go through the end of the course, right, in terms of mental health struggles that Gen Z in particular are having. But one of the things that's pretty apparent is that younger people increasingly lack this, right? They don't have strong, well-defined communities they belong to. And if religion is somewhat unique for those who are still part of it, and it's, in terms of young people, it's not a ton of them. In the most recent our general social survey data out of the US, for Gen Z are weekly attenders. So young people who go to religious services at least once a week. It's only 17% of the cohort. GSS has some issues in terms of its sample size, I think, but it's still one of our most reliable measures in the US. So it's a very small number, but they are part of these communities that are organic and continuous. And as I'll talk about in a sec, they are non-age stratified. And so religious communities seem to be one of those few spaces that have survived, even though, I would say based on the numbers, they're limping pretty badly, but they've still survived as these non-age stratified spaces, where young people get some interesting experiences. Okay, so let me clear off community, but keep in mind community, and we're going to keep coming back to this as we go through the rest of the course. And maybe, I know, I just want to highlight one other thing again, because I'll come back to it probably on Monday, depending on how far we get. This slide, I think, turns out to be, for me, one of the most important in the entire course, right? And especially, this number here and this number here. I know we talked about it last time, but I want to stress it again, because I do think these are really important numbers. And, if we're talking about why our devoteds are so different, I think almost all of the story for me is found in this column, right? Just in these stats. More adults that they are connected with, that they feel like they can talk to, turn for advice and help, not including parents. More adults that their parents know well enough to talk to, and less time spent unsupervised than their peers, right, on average. So anyway, we'll talk about this more when we talk about mental health. We'll come back to this question of adults because I think it matters. But for now, let's finish I just wanted to re-stress it because I think it's important. It's really important. I think, like I said, when we talk about some of Gen Z's mental health struggles, I think those numbers matter tremendously, and we're going to see some parallels in other literature. Okay, so we ended off, right? Moral order. We talked about moral order as being important because, it has our religiously devoted young people have a kind of set moral code, not established by kind of personal preferences. They're not moral consequentialists, so their morals are set, and the moral directives they follow around self-control and personal virtue are the ones that tend to be favored by kind of American society because of its long connection with religion and Christianity in particular. Spiritual experiences that reaffirm those, and then role models in their community that show them, positive lives, in this case shaped by religious orders, but role models can obviously be anywhere. Again, I think the difference is they're going to have more of them, right? Okay. So, number 4, community and leadership skills. What Smith and Denton suggest is that one of the things that religious communities seem particularly good at doing is providing opportunity. Because they are communities where stuff needs to get done, right? There are Sunday school or whatever religion you're in, right? There's kids' lessons to be taught. There's music to be performed. There's activities for youth and young adult groups to be planned, right? Kids and teenagers to be mentored, and all sorts of things. So for young people, what they suggest is, from earlier than a lot of their peers and with much more frequency and intensity, they are given chances to essentially practice the skills of being in community, right? How do you live with other people? How do you play a role in a community, right? How do you do a job? And often from relatively young ages, they are put in positions of leadership. Okay, so why does this matter? Well, it means that they get more chances to practice being in responsible positions, right? Now, always in a volunteer kind of setting, but they get more chances to practice these things than they otherwise would. So, for example, right? I have a friend. His name is Dave, and he has a daughter named Emily. Emily is charming young lady, and one of the things she wants to do is be a teacher. Now, because they attend a church, right, an evangelical church on the south side of Edmonton, Emily has been volunteering in the kids ministry basically since she was 12, right? So she has been, working with young kids, pre-K, kindergartners, elementary age kids since she was barely out of elementary school, right? Since she was in junior high. So by this logic, right, compared to, say, peers that she might have that are also in an education program that would have started, education and maybe working with kids when they were like, let's say 18, she has 6 years of extra experience working with kids, being in a responsibilized leadership environment where she had to plan activities for kids. So she has a sort of step up, right? She knows what it is to take leadership. She knows what it is to plan, right? All of these sorts of things. And this, at least in theory, and according to Smith and Denton, is going to pay dividends later because she has more chances to practice all of these things, right? So she has been in a leadership position and responsible for younger kids for much longer, right? Since she was 12. Now, always with mentorship too, right? When she was 12 years old, she wasn't doing it by herself. There were older people mentoring her and helping her along. And now, right, I think she's in charge of the entire kindergarten program at this particular church, right? So you get more chances to live in community, more chances to practice leadership skills. Okay, make sense? Okay, perfect. Coping skills. So we talk about coping skills. This is one where I have I guess last time I had a question mark next to it because I can never quite decide for myself whether I think this is, something that belongs. Oops, I didn't mean to delete everything, but I did. That's okay. This is one where I can never quite decide whether I think it is religious or not. So I always put, the religious aspects of, moral order, spiritual experiences, and then coping skills as a kind of question mark. Okay, so what are coping skills? I guess if we were to put things politely, stuff happens, right? You face struggles. People die, right? Friends die, parents die, siblings die, you get into trouble, your grades struggle, whatever it happens to be, right? Stuff happens in human lives. No human life is spared of hardships, no matter how much we might try. What Smith and Denton suggest is that religion offers scripts. What do you do when bad stuff happens, right? When you're struggling, when there are difficulties you face in life, religion offers scripts, ways of going through it that are prescribed. So it's a bit, you could call it a little bit of a hack from a social perspective, right? Is it skips, and here I'm going to write a word or a couple words. It skips having to figure things out ad hoc, right? So having to sort of hit a particular hardship and then sort out what you're going to do about it in the moment, right? Which is essentially what most other people will tend to have to do. And I'll give you an example, say in Judaism, right? When a member of your family dies in Judaism, at least in Orthodox forms of Judaism, the whole community sort of descends on your house and they stay with you for 7 days, right? They bring all the food, they do everything, and they help you through that first kind of week. And it's a very highly prescribed what you do, and it's called sitting Shiva, what you do when a member of someone's family dies, right? So there are, and then there are rules in Judaism of how you deal with grief and all of these sorts of things, right? So rather than figuring stuff out yourself and having to figure out how do I cope with this, religion offers scripts that tells you what you're supposed to do, even in terms of what the meaning of things is. Like, why do bad things happen? Why do people die? All of this stuff. Religion offers a guidebook here. Okay. So, sorry, does that all make sense? Okay, good. And then cultural and social capital. And again, like I was saying a second ago, one of the things that happens in religious communities is that you're mixed in with people of different ages, right? These are non-age stratified communities, right? There isn't, I guess technically speaking, there are kind of more youth-oriented churches, but for most churches, you're going to have a mix of people who attend them, right? From the elderly all the way down to, infants and preschoolers and toddlers and all of that stuff. So these communities are non-age stratified. And this is kind of unusual when we talk about youth, because most of the things youth do or young people do is in fact age stratified to a large extent, right? When you think of things like school, clubs, or para school activities, right? Like, I don't know, if you are in the Scouts, or if you are on a curling team or a hockey team, right? Whatever it happens to be, most, and obviously if you're in a classroom, most of the things you do are largely age stratified, right? Even university, I know there are some older students, but on the whole, you tend to be dealing with people who are between the ages of 17 and 22 for the most part, right? That's the kind of strata that university students mostly fit into. Religion is a little bit different than that, and it offers a kind of unique opportunity to people to be in these different environments doing different things. I guess the other one where you probably are non-age stratified to a large extent is work, right? But that tends to now come a little bit later. Okay, so there's two things that you can develop in these non-age stratified communities according to Smith and Denton, and these are cultural capital and social capital. So we've run across these terms before, right? And obviously if you've taken like SOC 100 or even some contemporary theories and you've run across guys like Pierre Bourdieu, you should be well familiar with these terms. But cultural capital, right, is essentially those non-tangible assets you bring to the world that you can use to get ahead, right? And what Smith and Denton suggest is that religious communities, right, by giving you this, hang on, I'm going to erase some of my other stuff here without erasing everything. Okay. Let's give myself a little bit more space. Pen. And let's go blue. By giving you this, right, religious communities allow you to develop this. They allow you to develop, better ways of speaking with, dealing with adults, how to navigate difficult situations, right? You build up your ability to talk to people, to navigate challenges, to plan, to be in leadership, right? All of which are aspects of social capital. You can, build up, your resume because you've got a bunch of volunteer experience. All sorts of things that you can build up in terms of social capital. But the most important thing here is learning how to navigate, talk to, handle both older and younger people in kind of a community setting, in a setting, where you're responsibilized. So you build your cultural capital in these communities, which means by the time you leave, you have, by the time you're an adult, you have more cultural capital than people otherwise would, right? Because you've had to take on more roles, you've had to practice more, right? And if you want a kind of weird illustration, this is not a religious communities one, But if you look at the book, this very famous book called The Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, and he talks in that book about kind of two different people. One is Robert Oppenheimer, and the guy's a guy named Robert Langdon. Both of these people are Robert Oppenheimer, obviously, is the father of the atomic bomb, and one is Robert Langdon is a nobody. He's super smart, and he runs a ranch in Montana somewhere, but he has an IQ of like 200. So one of the smartest people ever born. And in the book, Gladwell does a really interesting job of kind of looking at the differences. And one of the things that he notes about Oppenheimer was Oppenheimer had a ton of cultural capital, right? Why? Because his parents had sort of trained him from very young of how to talk to adults, right? How to present himself to adults. Like when he was 9, they took him to the New York Geological Society, where he gave a presentation on rocks because he found rocks really, really interesting. So this 9-year-old was giving a presentation to professional geologists, right? And they thought it was adorable, and they showered him with praise. Some of them offered to mentor him and all of this kind of stuff. Langdon grew up poor, never got really any training in cultural capital, and when he ran into problems in life, he had no idea of how to deal with them. And the contrast that Gladwell draws and how much cultural capital can help you is Robert Oppenheimer went to study in England and went a little bit crazy. And he tried to poison his PhD supervisor with a radioactive isotope. And he taught, he was brought up before the board of the university and threatened with expulsion. And he managed to talk his way out of it, right? He managed to convince them to give him another chance. Robert Langdon, who had very little cultural capital, he just did not know how to talk to people, went to like a second-tier community college in Colorado, had a problem with his schedule because his brother's truck had broken down, so he had no way of getting to the morning class that he was registered in. But because he didn't know how to talk to people, he could not convince them to transfer him from the morning session of that class to the afternoon session, wherein he never finished college, despite having a phenomenally high IQ and an understanding of quantum mechanics that most theoretical physicists don't have. And today he lives on a ranch in Montana and runs a ranch. He tries to publish scientific papers, but no one will give him the time of day because he doesn't have a PhD in astrophysics or quantum mechanics or whatever. He has no cultural capital, right? Okay, so that's a kind of extreme example of what cultural capital can do. But having more or less cultural capital matters because it means you have more or less ability to navigate your way through life and convince people to help you, right? Use your degrees, your knowledge, the way you speak, the way you dress, your problem-solving skills to get ahead in life. That's cultural capital. Okay, sorry, that was a really long cultural capital explanation. Does that all make sense? Okay, perfect. All right, social capital. Social capital is who you know, right? So, I mean, it's your social network, and especially, what matters, so I'll say it's your social network and how you can use that social network to get things out of the environment that you want, right? So you want a summer job, right? Do you know anyone who has a company that would hire you, right? You want, work experience. You want, whatever it happens to be. Do you have the kind of social capital to get those things, right? Do you have the connections to get those things? Do you know who to talk to? Do you have a friend of a friend? Or do your parents have a friend of a friend? And what Smith and Denton say is that religious communities inherently are kind of hubs of social capital, right? You can network with people there. People in those communities are going to know you. They're going to know other people. And you can use those connections to help you achieve what you want to achieve. Get that summer job, get that internship, whatever it happens. Okay, the sociologist Robert Putnam. So he wrote a very famous book, which I'm sure you've all heard of at this point in your sociology degrees, called Bowling Alone. And Bowling Alone is a really interesting book which is basically about the decline of kind of community and social capital in America. Now, Putnam thinks this is all because of cable TV, right? That what happens to people once you get cable is the world inside your house gets really interesting. The world outside your house is comparatively more difficult and more boring. So you have the slow but steady degradation of social capital, right? Of places that people gather together, make connections, and sort of live life together, if you will. Where the bowling league, up until really the 1980s, bowling leagues were very vibrant, right? Why? Because being at home was really boring. So you found activities outside the home where you could go hang out with people on a weeknight. And so a lot of people went bowling and joined bowling leagues, right? Because bowling is kind of fun. Once you get cable TV, according to Putnam, you start to see the decline of things like this, like adult sport leagues, bowling leagues, and all of these sorts of things. And what Putnam says in the book, and this book is published in the 1990s, is that, or is it later? Might be in the 2000s. I can't remember the date of Bowling Alone now. By the time he writes the book, he says about 50% of all social capital in America is generated in religious communities, right? Because they're the ones that are most likely to sort of survive the onslaught of cable TV. Now, obviously, since Putnam wrote, this situation has gotten markedly different, right? And now we have things like social media, video games. I mean, they had video games, but the kind of AAA video games that you play, the Red Dead Redemptions and, Grand Theft Autos of the world or whatever, these games are far more engaging, entertaining than anything, even like Fortnite, right? Than anything that ever was in the past. And then obviously, I think the other one would be streaming TV, right? We talked about the Netflix effect when we talked about a whole bunch of things. The Netflix effect was specifically coined for the decline in fertility that happens when Netflix comes into the market, because it's way more fun to watch Netflix than have sex, apparently, or just, easier to quash your boredom. But all of these things have a sort of detrimental effect on social capital, which again leaves religious communities in a sort of funny spot, where they're still generating social capital because people still show up to some extent in religious communities. So there's still a hub, and maybe the amount is higher or lower than 50%. I don't know, but they're still generating a lot of the social capital that's out there. Okay, I'm gonna clear off all my doodles because I got 2 more points. I told you this slide takes forever. But 2 more points, and I will say, on this slide, it's entirely possible that this one is the most important. Though they're all important. So network closure. Okay. Hang on. We'll go back a couple slides again. That's 7.3. 7.3 is network closure. Okay, so what does that mean? Network closure refers basically, in this case, according to Smith and Denton, to the fact that, or to the idea that one of the things that's good for young people is to have a relatively global or encompassing or surrounding community around you that's interconnected and talking to each other, right? So the more adults you have that know you, and know each other, it's more likely problems get caught. Okay, so what does this mean? So let's say that a young person is struggling, right? Maybe they're struggling with depression. They've started hanging around with a bad group of friends, right? They started dating someone who's a negative influence, right? They're developing relationships with antisocial peers. They've started stealing. They've started smoking or doing drugs or drinking. Network closure means that it's far more likely that these, 7.3 adults or more, right? It doesn't matter how many, are talking to each other, and it's going to be like, hey, I don't know if it's like the coach of the basketball team or the, youth group leader or whatever is talking to that kid's parents. And it's like, hey, little Johnny, something seems to be up with him, right? He's been cutting class and skipping basketball practice, and I think I saw him drinking, with or smoking, off school property the other day, after basketball practice. What's the deal with that, right? So whatever's happening with little Johnny, now the parents know, now they can address it, and it's more likely that kid gets help, right? And probably, then it's like the parents are like, oh, thanks for letting me know. And they talk to all of the other adults in that young person's life to let them know what's happening and to keep an eye out and to kind of nudge that kid back onto a more pro-social kind of path, right? So network closure really matters here, right? It means that if something's going wrong with a kid, it's more likely to get caught, it's more likely to get dealt with. That kid is more likely to receive the supports that they need in order to thrive, right? And again, like all of these numbers really matter, right? So there's more teens that a young person can turn to for support, not including parents, right? So they're more likely to tell an adult about the things that are happening, or a mentor about things that are happening, right? These people are more likely to communicate with each other, and more likely things are going to get caught. Why? Well, because they're with adults more of the time, right? They spend fewer evenings unsupervised, and they spend fewer afternoons unsupervised, right? So anything they're doing, they're more likely, things are going to be seen and caught. That's network closure, right? All of the stuff here is network closure. That's what this column is. Okay, sorry, does that make sense? Do you understand what network closure is? Okay, perfect. Good. The last one, I think I said this slide takes 20 minutes. I think it's taken me like 40. Oh dear. That's okay. Okay, the last one is extra community links. And this is just, religious communities tend to be connected to other communities, right? Other groups, other communities. So that basically if a young person wants to do something, if they have a goal, they can be connected with a community that can help them do that, right? If you want to feed the homeless, there you go. Your religious community probably knows someone at the Mustard Seed, right? You want to help, kids at summer camp? Well, there's 100 religious summer camps that you could volunteer at, right? And then gain more experience, right? Gain some community and leadership skills and all of that fun stuff. You move to a different city. Oh, your religious community is probably connected to another religious community in that city. So immediately they can find, especially if you say are someone like Muslim or Jewish, where they're deeply interconnected, right? Or Sikh, right? Well, you probably have someone like a distant relative or a friend of a friend who can welcome you in that place and help you get settled, right? So links between communities and through communities. Religious communities tend to be really good at generating these kinds of extra community links. So again, you don't have to find everything for yourself. Okay. So I'm going to try to blast through these pretty quickly. I don't know what this slide was supposed to be. Because I just want to kind of, so that was like when, sorry. That's out of that first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, talking about where millennials were as teenagers in terms of religion, and again, why we saw thriving in religiously devoted youth and less in others. So I just want to kind of follow that down a little bit, and I'll try to go through this relatively quickly because it's more charts, but just to illustrate a point, or the point again. So they followed this up, obviously with the second wave, so wave number 2, and a book called Souls in Transition. This time not Smith and Denton, but his new grad student, Patricia Snell. And they wrote a second book of it. I think it's called Lives in Transition. Okay, so they basically did ask similar survey questions, although they added some questions, obviously, in the second wave to make it more appropriate for emerging adults. Because now, most of those people who were 13 in that first wave are going to be 18 now. Those who were 22 are 27, right? So they've moved largely from adolescence through emerging adulthood. Okay, so what do they look like in terms of their religious profile? Well, they still split them into these four categories, right? The devoted, the regulars, and the sporadic. The devoted now, in emerging adulthood, only 5% of young people said they were devoted, down from 8%. The regulars are only 14%, down from over a quarter. The sporadic, went up from 17 to 17.9, so not a big change. The disengaged, right, grew from about 12 to about 25% of the sample. Okay, excuse me. So what Smith and Snell say is that looking at the results largely carry over, right? That there are small, in some cases, and in other cases larger, but still meaningful differences that suggest that these devoted emerging adults are adjusting to the transition a bit better than their less devoted peers. Okay, so, we can talk about things like, the average of feel extremely connected to their mothers or very close to their mothers, right? It's 88% of the devoted, 71% of the disengaged, right? And that's, the devoted are out of the ordinary for all young people. Do they get along really well with their mother? Well, 83 versus 72, 70, 71. Do they talk to their mothers about personal issues personal subjects very often, right? Again, 35 compared to 20 to 22 for the rest of the sample. They feel their mothers understand them better as well, right? So the quality of their relationships with their moms is better. Okay, close to their dads, well, they feel way less close to their dads than their moms, but still well above the rest of the sample. Do they get along well with their dad? Okay, I don't know why you're doing that. Please stop. Yeah, so they get along better with their dads than the rest of the sample, though here it's much more marginal. Do they talk? Apparently no one talks to their dads about personal issues. I guess dads are not for that. I guess that's what you do with mom. Right, but still, well above the rest of the sample, and especially above the sporadics or the disengaged. Their fathers understand them very much. Again, well above the rest of the sample. And, they've experienced fewer parental breakups, right? So 76% of them said that none of their parents had broken up versus 65, 61, 51. And we know divorce is hard even on emerging adults, and fewer of them had parents that broke up 2 or more times, though the difference is kind of marginal there. Okay, social engagement, right? They're more engaged with more things, considerably, although, what seems to make the difference is that they're obviously engaged in religious, activities sponsored by religious organizations, right? They're not that different when you look at, social activities not sponsored by a religious organization. Here, what I'll say is, again, mentors matter. And one of the things that Smith and Snell sort of stress in the book is emerging adults, right? Even once you're out of your teen years, into university, into emerging adulthood, moving out on your own for the first time, young people still need mentors, right? They still need people to help them navigate because they're learning how to navigate the adult world for the first time, and they still need that mentorship. So being connected to more groups, more organized activities gives them a chance to be connected with more people. Now, some of these people might be just older than them, right? So let's say, you're talking an 18-year-old kind of getting to know someone who's 22 to 25, right? That still matters because these people have still seen a bit more road than the 18-year-old, right? So, I mean, navigating through something like university, it can be really helpful to have some kind of friends who can help you kind of navigate through that when you're coming in as a 17 or 18-year-old, right? So mentors still matter. Older adults that can guide you through stuff matter, and the more chances you have to connect with these people, the better, right? So similar kind of thing. It's a social and cultural capital kind of marker, so that is helpful. Now, this is old numbers, right? I'm sure these are less distinct now, but they were less likely to be part of social networking sites and visit social networking sites once a day. Mind you, back in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, right? This was like a physical thing plugged into a wall. We hadn't hit the smartphone era yet. So I think that's interesting. Okay. Our risk behaviors, right? A similar profile, less drinking, way less drinking than the disengaged or the sporadics. Drinking who are drinking alcohol, 48% of them are doing it weekly or more, versus 2 times a week or never, way higher here. Binge drinking is a really harmful activity, right? It's really, really bad for you. And again, we see, far less of your religiously devoted people binge drinking, far more of them saying never than the rest of this sample. So, percent of 5 closest friends who do drugs or drink alcohol a lot, again, way lower, 16 versus like 50, 47, and 33%. So less risk behavior, same thing with smoking tobacco and smoking marijuana, right? Way less. Sorry, I covered up my number here. I just want to erase that. Has been in a serious fight more than once in the last 2 years. Where's that? Sorry, I lost my number. 12%, but less than half of the average and way lower than the other groups, right? And they're likely to be more risk averse, right? They take fewer risks. And, taking fewer risks tends to, at least to an extent, lead to better life outcomes because, risks obviously are called risks because they have possible negative outcomes. Okay. I don't want to overstress. I only got 2 more of these, I promise. I won't kill you with too many more charts. So they rate their physical health as better, right? They are more likely to be in a normal versus obese or overweight category. Though, I mean, the difference here is not big. And certainly the sporadics are less likely than them. So there's small differences. They're certainly under the kind of average for the whole sample. More likely to say that they're very or somewhat happy about their appearance and less likely to say they're very or somewhat unhappy, right? So body image, again, kind of holds true. A little bit more likely to say they're planning for the future, though not huge, and more likely to say they think about the meaning of life, a little bit less than twice as likely. Okay. They rarely, comparatively, right, we have a 10% gap in terms of saying they rarely or never feel depressed, less likely, by 4 times, twice or 4 times to say they feel that life is meaningless fairly or very often. And again, they're the most likely to say it rarely or never feels meaningless, more likely to say they feel loved and accepted by a good margin, especially over their disengaged peers. They're more likely to say they never feel invisible. Again, here the difference is relatively small. It's only 4% on the average. Slightly more likely to say our 2 most religious parts of the cohort are slightly more likely to say they feel guilty very or fairly often, and less likely to say that they never feel guilty. And, in terms of traumatic experiences in the last 2 years, it's about the same. Okay. Last one, I promise, last chart until I show you a bunch more charts, not the next unit, but the unit after that. Okay. So feel that life is close to ideal, right? They're way above the average, and they're on the high end of all these other groups. They're more likely to feel that the conditions of life are excellent, again, compared to all the other groups. Satisfied with their personal life, slightly better than the other groups. I don't think it's a huge difference. It's a 9-point gap on, the disengaged, but and certainly a 7-point over the average for the whole sample. They are more likely to say they've gotten the important things in life, and they score higher on the average life satisfaction scale than all of the others in the sample, right? So, in terms of life satisfaction, they are higher as well. All right, so what's the takeaway? Religion seems to matter, right, for young people, especially the devoted, right? The devoted are different. The religiously devoted are different across a whole bunch of measures, right? And it's pretty consistent. It looks like, in terms of the millennials, they were adjusting way better to adult life than some of their less religious peers were, right? So religion seems to have helped them move through those first, years out of high school through college and into adulthood a little bit more smoothly. Now that said, it's an interesting bit of trivia. And I mean, I could show you some information. British Bible Society just did a big national poll in the UK. They've actually been doing it every 2 years for the last 10. And again, it consistently shows that, in the UK, those who are the most religiously devoted are the ones with the highest levels of life satisfaction. It's a really robust social science finding that you can replicate across a whole bunch of locations, measures, and all of this fun stuff. But, aside from being sort of useful from a trivia perspective, it's not clear if it's useful, because religion is one of those things, right? You're either religious or you're not. I'm actually not convinced that people choose whether, their belief system suits them or whether it just sort of falls upon them. And you couldn't convince yourself to be religious if you wanted to. So, a bit unclear if any of this really helps or how it could help us manage the transition into emerging adulthood. But one thing I will say, again, the difference for me here really comes down to community, right? Religious communities are one of the communities that seems to have survived more intact than others, probably because they have a shared purpose, right? Whatever the religion is, right, that religion is the reason people come together, right? They're organic. They exist without any external support, right? The government doesn't need to give them money. People show up to church and synagogue and the mosque and the temple all on their own, right? Without any external prompting. These communities exist and they offer those benefits to the people who belong to them, basically for free and basically out of, just a shared meaning and purpose. So it gives the young people who belong to them a kind of edge up in life. And I think where you see the difference, right, in terms of the disengaged and the sporadics is as they've left religion, right, religion hasn't been replaced with other things, right? It's been replaced by nothing, right? It's been replaced by Netflix. It's been replaced by social media, which just doesn't have the same responsiveness or the same tight integration, shared purpose, and all of that stuff. And I mean, I guess I like to put it this way. There's always an old joke about Baptists, right? So it's a Christian denomination, that they're really good at making and delivering casseroles to people in their communities, right? You have a baby, you get 100 casseroles. You get sick, you get 100 casseroles. And if, social media is different in the sense that when something happens, people type in your comments, right? Sending hugs or something like that, right? But a much less tangible and much less engaged response. So as people have left religious communities, right, and we talked about this at the beginning, right, that growth of the nuns is people leaving religious communities. It hasn't been replaced with other communities that would fill in what religious communities used to do. And so you end up with these numbers of the kind of disengaged who are just sort of wandering without mentorship, without chance, without as many mentors, without as much chance to practice social and cultural capital and build those things up, with less network closure, and just less ability to have people help them through those early years, right? So mentorship matters, community matters, and religion remains pretty good at providing those things for that 17% of young people who are still there. Or sorry, that 5% of young people who are still there. The 17% was the disengaged in sample one. The 5% of young people who are still super religiously engaged get those benefits, and the others don't because they're at home, playing video games and watching Netflix. Okay. All right, so let's talk some other stuff. That's the National Study of Youth and Religion. Now we're going to move forward, right? Because that all had to do with the millennials. We're going to talk a little bit about Gen Z. Sorry, let me go forward one. So you'll recognize this chart because I showed it to you at the beginning of the lecture, right? This information comes from Springtide Institute. Again, they're a Colorado-based think tank. I guess they're the Springtide Research Institute. Okay, so Springtide Research Institute, right? And they track a bunch of stuff about young people, right? Every year they're doing research with young people and kind of trying to get a grip on what the lives of young people look like, what's going on with them. And they always have a religion focus, because, that's kind of where they had their start, is doing research on religion. Okay, so, we'll talk about their kind of findings on what Gen Z religion looks like, because they did this State of American Youth and Religion 2021. So the data was collected in 2020, and this is their kind of picture of what American youth religion looks like. Okay, and here I'll say, right, still about half the sample, a little bit more, says that they're Christian, especially if you add that tiny slice, the 2% here. So just over half of young people still identify with a Christian tradition, more of them saying they're just Christian, which is interesting for lots of reasons, which we don't need to worry about right now. If you take sociology of religion with me, talk about why that's interesting. It's a different kind of phenomenon, but still, fairly religiously engaged, with some marked disengagement, right? You've got your atheists, your agnostics, and your nothing in particular. Oh, sorry, atheists, nothing in particulars, and agnostics, right? Making up, 24% of the sample, so about a quarter of the sample in Gen Z. So Gen Z's religious kind of landscape, a little bit different, and we'll talk about what Springtide found. Okay, so Gen Z has a very different attitude towards religion and spirituality than past generations. And I think what's really notable is how disconnected they are institutionally. Now, I'll tell you this just for randomness. You don't need to remember this for the exam. One of the things that's been happening in a lot of places, and especially some of the numbers that have been coming out of England and Wales, suggest that there's a bit of a kind of youth revival in religion going on in England and Wales, right? The number of 18 to 25-year-olds attending religious services weekly basically tripled in England and Wales. And so people have been asking, people like Ryan Burge, well, is the same thing happening in the US? And the answer seems to be no. In terms of weekly attendance, it's about 17% of Gen Z that attends weekly. Now, when I looked at these numbers, I said, yeah, that makes sense, because Gen Z doesn't do anything, right? Gen Z is a generation that doesn't engage in institutions. So they're deeply disconnected institutionally. They don't show up to institutional settings very often, and that is true of religion. It's true of political parties. It's true of social clubs. It's true of almost anything. Gen Z is very much absent from real world institutional engagement, and religion is no different. Okay, so this is interesting. When they're facing uncertain and difficult times, do you not participate in religion or turn to religious, or why? Sorry, why when facing difficult times don't you turn to religious communities? And there's a bunch of reasons, right? So this is a select all that applies. So basically you can select any kind of statement, like the percentage of people who agreed with each of these statements. So, 60% of them say they don't believe some of the things they hear talked about in religious gatherings. A lot of them, and can I highlight this? I like highlighters. Want to discover their own answers to things rather than being handed a set of answers from a religious community. I want to talk about this in a sec because I think it's interesting. Other things help them find meaning in life. They don't need a faith community. Over half of them said that. They don't feel like they can be their full selves, right? So they feel like they have to leave part of themselves at the door. Half of them said that. Religious communities try to fix their problems instead of just being there for them, right? So just trying to change them or change something. The same as kind of one of the above there. Religious leaders try to give you answers, but you're looking for something else. Religious communities are rigid and restrictive. That's not helpful, right? That's still over half. Here, they just don't know how to connect, so that's interesting. They have other communities. They don't need a faith community. That's 50%. I almost guarantee some of those are communities online. Religion is about certainty and doesn't welcome uncertainty, doubting or asking questions. So I think that's related to, if I go, that's related to that one, maybe that one, right? So all those are kind of related. And then, and that's just under half. So there's some social disconnect, right? Religions talk about things that make them uncomfortable. They don't think religious communities will care. They don't trust religious organizations, right? So that's our deinstitutionalization. Institutions are inherently untrustworthy. They don't feel safe in institutions. They don't feel like they know anyone in a religion well enough to share their thoughts. And then this one, these are your cradle non-religious. They didn't do anything religious as a child, right? And 39% said that they'd been harmed by religion, faith, or a religious leader in the past. What they mean by that, again, is a little bit mysterious. Would not ever even think of it, right? So religion's not even on their radar. Okay. So hang on, I'll go back for a sec. I should talk and give a synthesis of this. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here. I think a lot of it deals with deinstitutionalization, and a lot of it deals with the concept that we're going to talk about in terms of Gen Z, what Josh Packard called faith unbundled. But there seems to be a shift in terms of how Gen Z understands what they want out of different contexts. And a big part of that is they want to come up with their own system, right? So if you want to talk individuality, right, or individualism, right, and how individualistic Gen Z is, it's fully on display in the way they are answering these questions. Because one of the things that you sort of expect, and other generations have sort of expected out of religion, is that you join a religion or you're part of a religion and you sort of bend yourself to fit that religion, right? You sort of shape your own beliefs and the structure of your life in order to fit the beliefs of that religion, right? Because religions are packages, right? They're packages of beliefs and practices that you take on if you are a member of that. And Gen Z is like, no, I want to discover the answers on my own, right? A significant portion of them. they're not going to just take on beliefs that they don't agree with, right? They don't believe some of the things, right? 60% of them say that, so they're not turning to religious communities, right? And on through this, right? It's the individualism, right? They want the religious practice and belief, if they have one, to fit the religion, to fit them, not them fitting into an existing community framework. Okay, here, right, this is really quite simple. I won't spend too much time on this. These Gen Zers perceive differences between what they care about and what religious communities care about. So this isn't religious communities answering this. They're saying what they think religious communities care about versus what they care about. And you see kind of big gaps. So they only 44% of them said they thought religious communities cared about LGBTQ rights versus 71% of them saying that they cared about it. Right? Same with gender equality. They thought only half of religious communities did. 77% of them say they care. So 25% gap. Immigration rights, 23% gap. Income inequality, 23% gap. Disability rights, 22% gap. Environmental causes, 21% gap, right? So these are big, big gaps between what they say they care about and what they think religious communities care about. Environmental causes, reproductive rights, racial justice, Black Lives Matter, and then the only one that's kind of, or I guess the only two that are below 20% are Black Lives Matter and gun reform, right? So, they perceive a big gap in what they value and what they think religions value. Okay. All right. So, that said, what we see in their data is kind of similar to what we saw with the National Study of Youth and Religion data. Now, I will say, this is not as robust, right? If you look at the kind of questions that Smith, Denton, Smith, and Snell were asking to try and determine life outcomes, it was much more robust than this. This is, I think, from a social science perspective, kind of on the wishy-washier side. And I'm not as convinced by this because it's self-perception, right? Rather than sort of trying to figure out through a bunch of relatively objective measures, how well people are doing, you are asking a very subjective question. Okay, that said, and with some criticism of the way the tool is being deployed, I also teach social methods, so we gotta criticize bad-ish questions when we see them. It's not a bad question, it's just far less objective. Okay, so of the young people who say they are flourishing a lot, so they ask them, would you say that you're flourishing a lot in different spheres of life? And they kind of class these people as very religious and not religious at all. So we're missing, again, the sporadics and the regulars, right? We've got our very religious and we've got our not religious. So what do we see? Well, there's a gap in how well they say they're doing, right? With the very religious consistently saying that they are flourishing a lot in romantic relationships, in friendships, in family relationships, in relationships with trusted adults, more than their not religious peers. Now, I will say, none of these is majority territory, right? It's still just a third versus, 23% and, 49, 48, 41%. So that still means there's a lot of, young people who are very religious who said they weren't flourishing a lot in these things, but there is a gap, right? And again, the gap is all double digits where our, at work, at home. Home seems to be a relatively happy place for the very religious. In finances, right? Physical health, again, so body image and that stuff. Mental health, there's just big gaps between these parts of the sample, right? Or these two different groups. Double-digit gaps in all cases. I think the smallest gaps are in friendships, right? There's a 15% gap. And in social media and online life, also a 15% gap. So there is at least a subjective difference in the way they perceive themselves as flourishing, right? The very religious feel like they're doing better than the not religious at all. Okay. How am I doing for time. Good. Okay. So, faith unbundled. So this is the kind of key finding of this particular report. And Josh Packard, called it Spotify as a religious metaphor. Okay, so we had MTD for the millennials. For Gen Z, we've got faith unbundled. So what is faith unbundled? So it is a term, right? Faith unbundled is a term, according to Josh Packard, that describes the way young people increasingly, hang on, I'm going to grab the old highlighter out, construct their faith by combining elements such as beliefs, ideas, practices, and community from a variety of religious and non-religious sources. What's a good highlighter color? Rather than receiving all these things from a single intact system or tradition. Okay, so the way they were answering those questions, it matters, because what Packard found and what they found in their qualitative interviews they did along with the quantitative surveys was that this is how young people sort of described how they were building their religion or their faith lives, right? So today, young people no longer rely on a single institution to make sense of their identity, engage a community, outline boundaries of belief, or practice that marks significant life moments. And sorry, one last color here, and I'll try to explain what any of this means. Can we do red? Religion is not a closed system, but an open system that flows in and out of other systems. Okay, so I remember, because I talked to Josh about this. We're not friends, but I've met him a couple of times. He's a really interesting guy, and very nicely gave me the time of day in an online forum where I got to ask him like 3 questions, which I was over the moon about. So why is this interesting, and what is this kind of telling us? And I think the way that he put it, and I always really liked it, it was that his assumption was, when he went into this research, right? He's a sociologist of religion, so he's kind of used to thinking of things in these belief system binaries, was that Gen Z doesn't think in kind of binaries, right? And so the way he put it is that he assumed that when it came to religious practices, that it would be tarot or the rosary, right? So you know what tarot cards are, right? Like fortune-telling tools, right? Where you pull the cards, and each card is supposed to have some meaning. And the rosary, if you don't know, it's a series of prayers in Roman Catholicism, right? You have a beaded, it's not a necklace, but it's a series of beads, and you count the prayers on the beads. And what he said, right, is if you're Catholic, you would be, doing the rosary, and then if you were kind of New Agey, you would be, using tarot cards. But what he actually found was was wrong. That for a lot of young people, it wasn't a question of tarot or the rosary. It was more of a question of tarot and the rosary, or Kabbalah and the rosary, or tarot and Kabbalah, or any number, or Reiki and centering prayer, right? So what Gen Z seems to be doing is a lot like what you see them doing in media choice, right? So he compares it to kind of, cable versus online and streaming music, right? Actually, let me keep to one thing. I'll keep to music, right? So if you tune into the radio station, right, and you go to, I don't know, what's a radio station? I don't listen to the radio. What's a radio station in Edmonton? 100.3 The Bear, right? What do you get on 100.3 The Bear? You get rock music, right? It's all rock music, and that's the thing you get. However, when you open Spotify, right, what you're getting is music that is specifically selected by you for you. And it's the same with kind of religious traditions. You can think of, Roman Catholicism as this. I'm sure no Catholic would like this comparison. 100.3 The Bear, right? It is one brand of religion where you're expected to sort of like, listen to all of the things there, follow the whole kind of Catholic tradition and fit yourself into it. However, if you move into off the radio into Spotify, well, suddenly religion is a bunch of different practices that you're getting because they feel right and they feel like they work for you. So you're sort of cobbling together your own religious identity from available cultural materials, right? So this is right, religion's not a closed system. You don't adopt Roman Catholicism or Islam or evangelicalism or Hinduism or whatever it happens to be wholesale. You're going to look around at the available cultural material and take bits and pieces from wherever it suits you. So you've unbundled religion. Yeah, Chloe.
What would you say is like the biggest difference between like millennial religious beliefs and Gen Z? Is it just the individualism or?
So yeah, I think so. I think it's the individualism, and I think it's the willingness to go outside of particular traditions. To go outside of one particular tradition and pick and choose and sort of put it together yourself, right? And that's a really good question, because it brings me to a point that I do want to make before I go to this slide. One of the things that Packard told me, because I asked him this question, is like, okay, is this just, moralistic therapeutic deism repackaged, right? Because as he was talking, I was like, okay, this sort of like, I find what I want, in the world is a little bit, it's very syncretistic, right? It's very much like, I'm going to find a religious practice that works for me, rather than, and if it's from Christianity, okay. If it's from Buddhism, okay. If it's from Islam, okay. Whatever it happens to be, and I'm going to put that together in a, Jeff or Chloe or whatever shaped package. And I said, is this just like an extension of moralistic therapeutic deism? And what Packard told me was no. He didn't think so. Because one of the real distinctions that he drew between MTD and Faith Unbundled, so MTD and this kind of millennial way of doing it, he felt was very passive, right? And you can kind of see it in that creed, right? You call on God when you need it, but you're not working very hard in terms of your religious beliefs, right? It's just like, whatever, it's these five, the 5 beliefs of moralistic therapeutic deism. I could flash back to it, but I won't. And it's very passive. On the other hand, what he said is what Gen Z seems to be doing is very active, right? So Faith Unbundled is very active in that in order to cobble together your own unique spirituality, you have to be asking a lot of questions, right? You actually have to be thinking quite deeply about religion, if a little bit unconventionally compared to other generational cohorts, right? So what he suggests is this is not actually easy work at all. Gen Z is really religiously engaged, and they're really interested in spiritual questions according to the findings of this particular piece of research. It's just that the way they conceive of it is so different from how other generations have, that it looks really unconventional, right? So millennial religion, I think, is much more conventional, and it's like binary. It's like, okay, either I accept or reject this religious tradition, but we all kind of accept these 5 basic ideas of MTD in a very passive way. Whereas it looks like Gen Z is being very, very active. Like if you're going to combine things, you're going to have to try really hard to fit all that together and find and try different practices that work for you. Does that answer your question? Okay, perfect. All right, last slide on religion, and then we'll take a break, and I'll go take some more Tylenol. Okay, so at one point last semester, I had a migraine so bad, I started switching between English, French, and Russian in the middle of a class, and I was like, okay, I gotta stop. Like, okay, this is not working. Today it's not quite that bad. So what does it mean to unbundle religion? Okay, so unbundling belief from a single source or system. Okay, so what does Packard say? It looks like curiosity, right? So that means you know, young people are turning to a variety of sources to make meaning, discern what they believe about right and wrong, about purpose, calling, salvation, suffering. So they're curious, right? And this makes sense, right? If you're coming out of a pluralistic culture, and if you want to go back to, Kenda Chrissy Dean, and kind of think about that, you know that there's a lot of different answers around, right? You have friends who are Hindu, you have friends who are Muslim, you have friends who are non-religious, you have friends who are atheist, agnostic, you probably have Catholic, Christian, evangelical friends, and all sorts of different belief systems. So you know there's a lot of different answers to questions around, and you're curious about why people believe what they do. And you want to kind of put together a system of belief that works for you out of what's available. And there's a lot available, right? It's a much more complex religious environment than, say, what the baby boomers grew up in, right? Where, the baby boomers would have grown up and there was Protestant and there was Catholic and maybe a couple of atheists around. But given how small those numbers were, the chances are you really didn't know it that many of them, right? Today, right, the panoply of different belief systems is vast. You're aware of them. You have access to them as well through the internet. So it's much different. Okay, unbundling identity from a single system. So Gen Z is unwilling, according to Packard, to shed part of themselves to fit into pre-prescribed narratives about who and how to be in the world, right? So they want to be themselves, right? And this idea of being your authentic self is a very Gen Z idea, right? And they want to bring that into whatever their beliefs are about the world, right? So they are committed to that. Okay. Unbundling community. So it means, they show up where there's trusted personal relationships or new ones seem possible, right? So they're interested in community, they're interested in relationships, but they're willing to forgo participating in communities where they don't think they can have these authentic personal relationships with trusted adults, right, or trusted people. Okay, and practices, right, we'll just say it's very flexible, right? It's tarot, Reiki, and the rosary all together, right? Whatever works, whatever you can construct that makes you feel good, that makes you feel fulfilled. It helps you make sense of the questions you're currently facing, right? It's a very flexible worldview, not one that's going to be like, okay, I need to know what the answer to this question is. Why don't I break out the Catechism of the Catholic Church and see what ye old Catholic Church has to say about this question? There's a lot of shifting around. There's a lot of different practices they're going to try and all of that stuff. Okay. Hey, any questions before I end this, and we'll take a, say a 15-minute break, and then we'll see if we can do crime. Crime is short, before the end of today, and then jump into a new topic next week. Questions? Yeah, please.
Do you think like any of those like charts you're showing for like the engaged and disengaged, they can have like some sort of like bias in it? Like obviously with any survey you could, but like maybe they feel like they have to answer a certain way because it would be like unfaithful for them to not, or something like that.
Yeah, so you're talking about social desirability bias.
Yeah.
I mean, it's possible, right? And it's definitely really difficult. That's one of the hardest things to control for in social science research, especially with people who are part of a group. So let me put it this way. I feel like this one is probably much more susceptible to social desirability bias.
Yeah.
In terms of like, okay, I'm very religious. I know I feel like I should be, flourishing a lot in this sphere, right? Because it's like, I know that that's kind of what we think, I don't know, like good Christians should be like, right? With the ones from the National Study of Youth and Religion, I think the way the questions are constructed do as much as possible to get around social desirability bias, right? In not, asking the questions as subjectively, things like how often have you smoked, right?
Yeah.
Like people might lie about that, they might not, right? How many sexual partners have they had? They might lie about it, they might not. There's really no way to control for social desirability bias. So it's possible, but it's still, I guess, the best tool we have to measure social behavior. And I think the more objectively you kind of ask questions, right? Like I'm going to flash back and give you all seizures again. How often do you feel, depressed or sad, right? How often do you feel life is meaningless? They're relatively objective questions, right? So hopefully people are giving you relatively objective answers outside of their religious traditions. But again, there's always going to be social desirability bias. I know some people even don't believe the weekly attending numbers because people are like, of course I go to religious services because I feel like I should. One researcher did a funny thing where he said, okay, so he bought a tranche of advertising data for cell phones where you can track how people move around. And he's like, okay, so 25% of Americans, say they go to religious services weekly. He's like, based on their cell phone movements, the number's actually closer to 5. Right? He's like, otherwise, Sunday morning would be the busiest time on the roads in America, and it definitely isn't. I don't know that I buy that particular piece of analysis because cell phone data is not complete ever. But there's definitely a possibility of social desirability bias. The more objectively you ask questions, the less likely, which is why, like I said, I like the National Study of Youth and Religion numbers more, because I think they're trying to measure things, like think or plan about your future. Are religious people more likely to answer that? Would they know inherently that they should be thinking about their future more? I can't see how. Or thinking about the meaning of life. Again, they're trying to ask these questions in an objective way. But yeah, I think definitely when you get to the faith unbundled stuff and you're like, how are you doing? There's a much greater chance for social desirability bias there. I think these ones all definitely, this seems pretty raw and honest. But I don't know if I answered your question. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, can I stop talking now? Okay. But yeah, sorry. Like, where's the end of my sentence? My sentence will end now, period. But yeah, I think it's possible, but the National Study of Youth and Religion stuff is designed by really good social scientists who are trying to mitigate for that as much as possible. So
I feel like this one might be a little.
It's a little
desirability, based on the question stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit more like, how you doing? Like, this is like flourishing, right? It's this is why I said it's way less rigorous than.
Even if it was how do you feel about LGBTQ? Obviously somebody's not going to straight up be like, I hate it.
Probably not. Yeah.
They're going to want to be more open.
Yeah, exactly, because they know that that's correct. And then, like I said, there's no way to totally correct for social desirability bias. Even online surveys, because we thought if you're not actually talking to a person, that people would answer more honestly, and it's not always the case. So yeah, but it's one of the foibles of social science research. Everybody lies, even to themselves. So okay, other questions? I sound like House from House MD. Everybody lies. I did a colorful job of this slide. I'm quite proud of it. Okay, let's I love my pen. I'm not sure the students love it, but I'm never giving it up. Okay, let's take a break. So it's 25 after, so let's like 2:40, 2:41. We'll come back and we'll talk about crime. We'll talk about crime, youth and crime, very briefly. Talk about youth and crime. We'll try to get it done, and then next week we can jump into talking about fun stuff like mental health and technology. Can I tell you something random, which I will repeat later, but for no reason? I just found this out. So Facebook, because Facebook is inherently the most evil company on earth, apparently on Instagram and on Facebook, when they would see a young woman between 15 and 25, delete a selfie, they had it set in the algorithm to automatically serve them ads for beauty products. It is crazy because it's like, wow, this person must be feeling bad about their appearance. So probably we could sell them a bunch of beauty products. And so I'm like, wow, that is unusually evil and far more evil than I actually suspected Facebook was. And I suspected they were pretty evil. So Yeah. Anyway, let's go. We'll come back at like 40, 42, 42-ish. I'm gonna go. I don't know, take some more time off, and we'll see how it goes from there. And ponder how evil Facebook is. Yeah, it is nuts. Alrighty, let's jump in here. We'll talk a little bit of youth and crime, and then we will be done for the week. Oh, I didn't mention exams. I started marking them yesterday. I'm going to keep working on them tomorrow. We'll definitely be done before Monday's class, but you know, it's a short. The spring is such a short timeline. Oh, it's like you wrote it 2 days ago, and I already feel bad that I'm not done marking it. So we will start working on it here. Okay. So talking a little bit about youth and crime, this is going to have a distinctly Canadian flavor because most of this data and most of this what's here comes from when I taught SOC 321, which is Youth, Crime, and Society. So I've taken a few bits and pieces out of there. So if you've taken that class with Brian, some of this might seem a little familiar. Okay. It's definitely not on Wednesday. Wednesday's the last day of class. I'm not actually allowed to schedule the final for that day. I wanted to say it was the 13th, but I think someone said it was on Bear Tracks. It says the 12th. Well, what I'll do is I'll just open it for the 12th and the 13th, write it whenever you want on either of those days, and I'll mark it afterwards. But yeah, I'll just make it available on both the 12th and the 13th. I don't know if I'm allowed to do that, but nobody tell on me, and we should be good. Okay, you can't see my slides. How so? Amazing. Window capture. Can you see them? You can see them now. I know you can because now I can see them. Okay, cool. But yeah, I'll make it. I'll make the exam open on both on Thursday and Friday of next week. I cannot believe spring classes are almost done already. This is so crazy. Teaching in the spring is nuts. All right, let's do this. Okay, now you can see my slides. Okay, so youth justice system. So when we talk about kind of youth as a separate category as considered by the criminal justice system, this is something of a recent occurrence, right? So if we had gone back, to the beginning of the class, right, when we were doing the history of youth and childhood, we could continue like with this information from largely where we kind of left off in that class, right? Because the development of a separate youth criminal justice system is largely an outgrowth of that kind of slow, steady development of an idea of, young people and children as separate social categories, kind of coming to fruition in the creation of unique institutions, right? So the 18th century, right? So we're talking about the end of the 1700s, right? The term juvenile delinquent is used for the first time, primarily as a legal term to describe violations of the law by a person below the community's age of adulthood, right? So it's not until, from a historical perspective, the end of the 18th century that we even get a notion of juvenile delinquents as entirely separate from just, delinquency or crime in general. Okay, by the 19th century, especially as we get towards the end of it, the term was in widespread use, and so basically from about 1850 forward, across a bunch of different places, you start to get sort of piecemeal approaches to creating a youth criminal justice system. The first kind of pieces of it are actually, reformatory institutions that are aimed at helping juvenile delinquents to kind of turn their lives around, specifically, typically by teaching them skills. So you have things like, towards the middle part, you see this in England, you see this in France, you see this in Canada, the US. You get the development of industrial schools and residential schools where people are basically sent by the courts to be reformed, right? And this actually happens before you get the development of a distinct youth criminal justice system. But already you start to see like the echoes that there is a problem, right? We've had a youth crime problem, a problem of juvenile delinquency rather, that needs to be solved, and people start building institutions in a kind of piecemeal way. Okay, from a legal perspective, we have a couple of really important legal frameworks that we need to talk about. So, one, there's always been a sort of different legal treatment of people below a certain age, right? Going back into English common law, right? We can go back into the 14th century, right? So 14th century, we're talking the 1300s. And we already find, some aspects of the law that are applied differentially based on age, right? So prior to the 19th century and going back to the 14th century in English common law, we already have, basically rules saying that children under 7 can't be convicted of a criminal offense, right? Youth between 7 and 14 under, old British common law were subject to what was called doli in capax, the presumption that they were unable to do harm unless the Crown, right, so the Crown prosecutor could prove otherwise, right? So basically between 7 and 14, if the Crown wanted to pursue, legal charges or criminal penalties, they had to prove that this person was in fact capable of understanding what they were doing. And so doli in capax, is a legal doctrine that literally translates to incapable of doing harm, right? It's in English, it's Latin obviously, but it comes out of English common law, and it's this presumption that children ages 7, below 7 aren't able to understand what they're doing at all, and between 7 and 14 can't be prosecuted for committing criminal offenses unless, the presumption of doli in capax is contested by the Crown. Okay. So how does this kind of translate to today's legal framework in Canada, right? And other kind of British common law territories, like the US. I know America's weird, but a lot of their law is still based on British common law. Obviously the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and some other former British colonies. So how does this play out? Well, today we, that presumption of doli in capax is sort of still built into the legal structures that we have. But today we call it diminished criminal responsibility, right? And this is the basic view that individuals who are not fully adult can't be held fully responsible for their criminal behaviors. And today, diminished, doli in capax or diminished criminal responsibility is sort of sorted into 3 categories, right? So, no criminal accountability. And in Canada, this is below 12. Below 12 years old, you have no criminal accountability. So you can't be prosecuted, you can't be charged, prosecuted for crimes. There can be other ramifications, in terms of questions of your family, you or your family being referred to social services, right, to the child welfare system, but you're not presumed to be responsible if you're below the age of 12. Between 12 and 17, you have what's called limited criminal accountability. So there's a presumption that those between 12 and 17 do understand enough what they, that they're breaking rules, that they can be charged, prosecuted, and put through the legal system, albeit with, typically diminished consequences because of a presumption that they don't fully understand what they are doing. Now, different jurisdictions obviously treat this differently. In Canada, this is pretty rock solid. It's essentially under Canada's current piece of youth criminal justice legislation, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, or YCJA, impossible, not 100%, but virtually impossible to try a minor as an adult, right? So, even if you're 16 and you murder somebody, getting you sent to adult court is virtually impossible in Canada. In the US, it's a little bit different. A lot of young people in the US are tried as adults because they have a slightly different criminal justice system, still based on English common law. And the district attorney will have to make the case that someone should be tried as an adult, but it's in Canada it's virtually impossible. Okay, and then full criminal accountability, right? That's 18 plus. Once you're an adult legally, there's a presumption that you understand well enough what you're doing to be tried as an adult. Okay, there's no emerging adult category here just yet. So maybe we'll get there one day. All right, so one day I will find another word to say than so when I transition between thoughts. Until then, Canada's kind of legal framework in terms of youth criminal justice from its kind of inception was based on what's called a child welfare model, right? The idea that when a young person encounters the criminal justice system, the role of the state is, rather than being punitive, so it's not punitive, but rather it's more parental, right? Or you can say corrective. The goal is to get the person back on the right path, right? And this is based on, another legal concept referred to as parens patriae, which quite literally translates from the Latin to father of the country. And that is basically saying, that the government, right? So the government, the state, the government or the state, in a sense, is the father or the parent of its citizens, especially young ones, right? So that's, when we're talking father of the country, the state is the father or the kind of parent of its citizens. Okay, so based on this idea, right, the state has a particular relationship to its citizens, the idea has been for a long time in kind of Canadian law, and we'll talk about going back right to the first piece of Canadian youth criminal justice legislation, the the Juvenile Delinquents Act. Sorry, the Juvenile Delinquents Act. That the state has a duty, right, to take on the role of a parent in the case of delinquent or dependent children with no parents, or parents who are, unable to correct their children, right? Who are not doing their job correctly. Okay, and there's this belief that misguided children need to be treated with, friendly helpfulness. That basically the role of the state is to kind of get them back on the right path, right? It's to be helpful. It's not to be too punitive. So early in kind of, Canadian history, and like when we talk about the Juvenile Delinquents Act, and I'll spell it out in a second, judges were given a lot of discretionary power to deal with delinquents as they saw fit. One of the things that happened early in Canadian youth justice legislation is that rather than relying on incarceration, probation was the preferred tool that was used to basically get the attention of or to manage the lives of young people that came before the court. Okay, yes. I'm assuming that means you can see my slides, or just a general yes, just yes to everything. Will the Oilers win tonight? Yes. Is the spring semester almost over? Also yes. Okay. So our first piece of juvenile or youth crime legislation in Canada was the Juvenile Delinquents Act. This is also Canada's longest standing piece of youth justice legislation because basically this legislation was in force from 1908 till 1984. Now it went through significant amendments over time, but it stood for almost 80 years. Okay, so this was the first piece of legislation that actually addressed juvenile delinquency as a particular problem. And again, you can see how late this is, right? 1908, right? You're into the beginning part of the 20th century. So this is, now just over a century ago. It's really, really recent from a historical perspective that young people had their own kind of piece of legislation that dealt with, them as as different category under the justice system. Okay. Now this was a kind of interesting piece of legislation. I will tell you a little bit about its genesis. Okay. Oh, good. I have the genesis on the other slide. I was just going to start talking about it, but I realized I have the information somewhere else. Okay. It was pretty flexible, and like a lot of federal legislation in Canada, it's in coordination with the provinces. The provinces have quite a bit of say over how it's implemented. Even today, right, say in Alberta and Quebec, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, our current piece of legislation, is implemented in Alberta and Quebec quite differently. So it sort of set minimum or maximum, the minimum, was 12. The maximum range for juvenile delinquency could be set, from 15 to 17, after which point you would have been an adult. Most places set it at 17, but some places set it as 15 for different reasons. Alberta's was a little bit lower. I think Alberta's was 16 up until the repeal of the law and then its replacement in 1984. Okay, so it comes out of a really peculiar history. So right around the same time, legislation is being considered and passed in a bunch of different places globally, all across the kind of Anglo-American world. So in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, people are working on these similar kinds of legislations, and they all kind of borrowed ideas from each other. And the same was true in Canada, right? Now, Canada's early legislation was very much influenced by the United States, and to a lesser extent by the United Kingdom, right? Okay, so key leaders of this were guys like J.J. Kelso and W.L. Scott. Now, what's really kind of interesting is that both of them were kind of participants in what's called the child saving movement in Ontario that starts kind of in the 1880s. Now, this is a particular social movement that started out in the United States and sort of spread into Canada. And so, you can kind of tell by what, so Kelso was a journalist in Toronto, lobbied for an act for the protection and reformation of neglected children, and an act for the prevention of cruelty and better protection of children. So you see that in the kind of historical development, right? And if you kind of think about what we talked about earlier in the course, right, this is these middle-class white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who suddenly have discovered that their own, or a while ago discovered that their own children were these precious kind of creatures that needed to be protected. They sort of become aware of the social problems being created in Anglo-American society by industrialization. And they're like, oh no, there's all of these other children that also need to be protected, right? And so they have this, what's called the child saving movement. Now they have particular notions of what children need to be saved from, but we'll talk about that. Okay, so the US, right? There's really strong US influence on the JDA, particularly this child saving movement. Now, what else? I guess what I'll say is this is very much a white Protestant movement. Or, if you want to put it in, kind of derisive terms, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, right, or WASPs. which is a sort of slang for white people who are also Protestants. And one of the things that, especially coming out of the US, you're dealing with a period of really high immigration from places specifically like Ireland, Italy, and Poland. And a lot of those people come over. They're quite poor. Both parents are working. They have quite a few children. And so children are kind of running around in the streets, causing a little bit of trouble, committing petty crimes and all of these sorts of things. And so these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants are like, oh, we need to deal with this problem of youth crime, and specifically bad parenting caused by Catholics, right? All these Catholics, they have so many children, and then they don't parent them properly, and they get into trouble. So it's quite a pejorative anti-Catholic movement as well. All right, so the child-saving movement, right, is all about these rich and middle-class white Anglo-Saxon Protestants looking down on other social classes and being like, we need to save their children from the bad parenting and poor morals and values that are being instilled by these principally Catholic parents. Okay, other influences, you have sort of juvenile justice experts in the US. People like Harvey Hurd and Ben Lindsay, who are kind of pioneers, right? They're some of the early kind of judges in youth courts, particularly in Cook County, which is in Chicago, right? And the first youth court is established and employs some of these people in Chicago in 1898, right? In the Cook, I don't know if I have that here. I don't, okay. I have it in a different lecture, in a different course, right? So it's in Cook County in 1898, right? The Cook County Juvenile Court is established, and in terms of like when you're looking at who you're gonna build your youth court philosophy on, it's the judges of that court, people like Hurd and Ben Lindsay. The other one that they look at in creating the Youth or Juvenile Detention Act is the Philadelphia probation model, which basically is a system that rather than putting young people necessarily in prison, puts them on probation, where they have to report to the court regularly, and they have a probation officer that manages their rehabilitation and reintegration into society under the eye of the court. And this probation officer, is supposed to meet with them, find them regularly, make sure that they are, going where they're supposed to be going if they're sent to, say, like an industrial school or a residential school to learn a trade typically. And then if they're not, refer them back to the court for further action. Okay. And yeah, I mean, you've got like I said, all sorts of this stuff going on all over the Western world at the same time. And there's considerable cross-fertilization of ideas, right? Where people are just trying to figure this out. So it's not, one of the things that's probably true about the initial youth justice systems everywhere is nobody really knows what they're doing, right? Everybody's just kind of making stuff up as they go and grabbing what look like good ideas from all over the place. So when you end up with the JDA in 1908, it's very much a grab bag of ideas taken from here, there, and everywhere by people who don't really know what's going to work. And what's interesting is it lasts as long as it does. Okay, so it has a couple of interesting things that it builds into the system. So it has a really wide net in defining delinquent behavior and dependent children, right? So it's able to set the terms quite widely. The other thing that it sets up is what are called status offenses for young people. And this is, offenses that you could basically be found of just because you're underage, right? So like today, if you get caught drinking, right, and you're 17, you've committed a status offense, right? Because you're possessing a restricted substance as a minor, right? That's a status offense. You have the status of a minor, so you are automatically, if you are, in possession of alcohol or certainly drinking alcohol, you are in, abeyance of that particular piece of legislation. And then things like truancy, right? If you are not going to school and you are, say in Canada, under 16 years old, that is a status offense. By not being in school and being under the age of 16, you are violating some kind of law. Okay. The other one with the Juvenile Delinquents Act, and the one that was probably most problematic, was that judges had the ability to impose indeterminate sentences, right? So sentences of probation with no fixed expiry date, right? And here it was because the state was your friend. So why would you need to end your relationship with the state? It's your parent, it's your friend, it's treating you with friendly helpfulness. So basically, until you reached whatever it was, either 16 or 18, depending on your jurisdiction, that sentence wouldn't necessarily end. There's something else that goes along with this, and I had it in my head a second ago, and it's escaped my mind. Oh, right. Under the Juvenile Delinquents Act, young people were given no due process, and most specifically, they did not have the right to a lawyer, to legal representation. It was actually discouraged. Why? Well, because, the state is your parent, the state is your friend. Do you need a lawyer to talk to your mother or father? Clearly not, right? And if the state is, the father of this person, well, why would you need a lawyer to talk to the state? So there's all sorts of weird and interesting problems, with the JDA, and it remains in force until 1908. Sorry, not 1908, 1984. And up to 1984, juvenile delinquents technically have no right to due process and no right to legal representation before the court. The expectation is they're going to appear before the court by themselves, right? Okay. So this, this piece of legislation gets replaced in 1984 by what's called the Young Offenders Act. And this piece of legislation is sort of brought to bear at the end of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau administration in Canada, right? His role as prime minister, and mostly implemented under the government of conservative, or I guess progressive conservative, Brian Mulroney. So it's brought in to replace the JDA. So I was going to tell you, if you remember the chart on crime that I showed you earlier in the course, but that wasn't this course. That was a different course. That was SOC 100. What kind of happened from about 1960 till the end of the 1980s, right? Let's say about 1991, is crime in Canada kind of goes like this. It kind of goes up this slowly rising wave. And if you know anything, just about general criminal profiles, the people most likely to commit crimes are people between, well, they're young men typically, between 15 and about 23, 24. That's your, young women also between these ages are more likely to commit crimes. By the time you get to 40, right, most people stop committing crimes, mostly because you have a lot more to lose once you have, some possessions and a job and family and all of these sorts of things. You don't want to commit as many crimes. But our typical criminal profile is between 15 and 23. Because there's a lot of baby boomers around, starting in the 1960s, a lot of young baby boomers, you get a kind of rising wave of crime. But the thing that happens is people start to react to this by calling for reforms in Canada's youth justice legislation, viewing the JDA as inadequate, right? It's too friendly. It has this notion that the state needs to parent these delinquent young people rather than punishing them, right? And deterring them by giving them harsh sentences. So the Trudeau government implements, the process of, it starts to pass the Young Offenders Act. It's fully passed in 1984 and then implemented principally under Brian Mulroney's government. Some people saw it as a long overdue reform. lots of people saw it as a troublesome transference of the youth criminal justice system to a much more punitive criminal justice kind of model rather than a child welfare model. Although, and you know, some people even criticized it for adding due process for young offenders, especially the right to legal representation, just like an adult, you know, and habeas corpus, speedy trial provisions, and all of these things that are under due process. Okay, so yeah, it was lots of people criticized it for being a justice and crime control based approach rather than a child welfare based one. And it sort of got it from both sides. Critics of the legislation viewed it as representing, yeah, this unfortunate shift from our child welfare. It also, I say it kind of got it from both sides because on the left, right, this was very much the view of the left, right, that it was an unfortunate shift away from child welfare based on this child saving approach towards a more crime and justice based approach. On the right, people tended to view it broadly as soft on crime, right? That this piece of legislation did too much, you know, in adding things like due process to protect, you know, young offenders and their rights, often at the expense of the general public. And I've got it on I got these little comics, right? So this is a comic from the era, right? This is, obviously you wouldn't know this because you didn't live through it, Brian Mulrooney, because he was always portrayed as having a giant chin for some reason. He did have a pretty big chin, but that's comically exaggerated, right? And you see that this young offender has murdered a woman and is getting a lollipop that says Young Offenders Act on it and is being told that they're bad, right? So amongst the things that this legislation did was that it imposed publication bans on the names of young offenders, and it sealed their youth records, right? Okay, so I guess three things. So publication bans, right? So even if someone was murdered, you know, the murderer, if they were underage, their names couldn't be published in newspapers, right? To protect them against the future consequences of their current actions, right? Because if you think Dolly and Capox, they might not be fully cognizant of what that means. So you don't want to ruin their whole lives by publishing their names. Okay, so that was one of the big criticisms. It imposed differential sentencing as compared to adults and made it very hard to try young people in adult court. So, you know, regardless, I think, what was it under the Young Offenders Act? For the crime of first-degree murder, the maximum sentence was 7 years, right? Much of that could be cut down with good behavior, and so someone could go on parole, you know, I think it was 3.5 years even for first-degree murder. Violent sexual assault was similar, right? I think a 7-year maximum sentence with easy to reduce that and get on parole much more quickly. So people saw this, you know, especially on the right, as a very soft on crime piece of legislation, which is where this, you know, particular political cartoon comes in, right? And so by the 90s, this piece of legislation had become untenable. There was so much public pressure on it to be repealed and replaced with something else that, you know, by the early 1990s, the government of Jean Chrétien and then Paul Martin felt they needed to replace this piece of legislation, which is what happens, right? So the work on a new piece of legislation, the Youth Criminal Justice Act, starts in 1998. A white paper on it is published in 2000. And the legislation is drafted and brought into force at the kind of end of the Chrétien Paul Martin liberal governments, and then implemented by the Harper government in the 2000s. So it's introduced to replace, in 2003, to replace the Young Offenders Act. Again, everything gets criticism. Criminologists and government policy analysts at the time trying to assess its kind of practices broadly disagreed with how it had, you know, there was broad disagreement on whether it was good or bad, with lots of people, including Brian Hogeveen, who's in the department here, at the time saying that this was a troubling shift more towards that criminal justice kind of framework, but others like University of Toronto's Dube and Cesaroni, seeing it as a positive shift. But yeah, I mean, it was seen at the time, and I think in retrospect, unfairly, as part of a broad shift away from a child welfare model of juvenile justice towards a legally and maybe punitive one in a crime control model. But I think one of the more interesting things that it did, and one of the big success stories of the Youth Criminal Justice Act, has actually been in the way that it created a bifurcated or two-pronged system in Canada to differentiate between non-serious and first-time offenders and more serious, persistent kind of criminal offenders, and dealing with them in different ways. So, how much do I have on this? Oh, not nearly enough. Okay, I'll tell you a little bit about this. How am I doing for time? Oh, we're doing okay. Just no questions? No questions. Okay. So, one of the things that this system does, right, is most people, and especially first-time offenders and non-serious offenders, generally are not put in prison, right? No prison. They are given what are called extrajudicial sentences, or we'll call them extrajudicial sentences, because I can't say extrajudicial. I have to really focus. For whatever reason, those words just it comes out wrong. So extrajudicial sentences, basically outside of the criminal justice system, where you would get things like counseling, drug treatment, community service, restorative therapy, right? All of these sorts of things. And only the most serious offenders and chronic offenders get put in prison. Now, the logic of this has always been that most of your, first-time offenders, if you put them in prison, they will tend to become chronic offenders, right? Because prison is criminogenic. But if you divert them, right, so it's called diversion, out of the criminal justice system, most of them never commit any other offenses, right? So diversion is the key to the youth criminal justice system. And so that's why, I think a lot of the criticisms that it moves away from a child welfare model are unfair, because it actually, for most of the people in this category, it actually takes their welfare into account to a tremendous degree and wants to make sure that they don't spend any time in prison. And it's been very successful in that. Okay. Oh, sorry, maybe it's Dubin Sprout, not Duden Cesaroni. I think Dubin Cesaroni, got it right. The law was drafted to reduce the level of punitiveness, and others, I like Brian, but Brian Hogbeen and Samditch, were worried that it was part of a getting tough on juvenile crime approach, concerned that it would create adulteration, right? A merging of the youth and adult criminal justice systems. But I think, the conclusion that it actually reduced the punitiveness of the system is correct, especially for that 90% of people who get diverted out of the system. Okay. I guess I got ahead of myself here a little bit. Most of our kind of approach to youth crime, it comes out of that tail end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And, was a response to those immigrant patterns or immigration patterns, the kind of high social dislocation that came with industrialization, and a way of trying to correct that institutionally, and especially get kids into things like school, correct their behavior, give them skills so they wouldn't have to turn to crime. It changes a little bit. We see a changing pattern of juvenile delinquency, under the JDA from, when it was written to the 1960s. And it's just clear that by, the 1970s, a different piece of legislation is needed, right? Which is why you get the Young Offenders Act and the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It's no longer, as much young people who are, say, abandoned by their parents, left alone in the street that are committing crimes like it was in the late 19th and early 20th century, the criminal pattern becomes much different starting in the 1960s. Bless you. And all of that stuff. So that's why we get this shift, right? And it's clearly a different pattern of criminal behavior as we go from early in industrialization, bless you again, to a more developed society where crime starts to take on a different flavor, especially by the time you hit the 70s, a lot of crime ends up being tied into the drug trade, right? And that's true right up until today. Okay, I am going to tell you a weirdly funny story about sneezing in class, because I always try to say bless you. And one time someone sneezed in class and I said bless you, and someone wrote who was watching at home, and they're like, this really freaked me out because my dog just sneezed, and you said bless you like right after, so I thought you were saying bless you to my dog, which I think is kind of funny for doing hybrid classes. Okay. I'm just going to take a quick look here. All right, we don't have much left. We'll see how we do. So, adolescent crime. When we talk about the post-1960s period and patterns of crime, especially street crime, the assumption has largely been that street crime is driven by economic compulsion. Basically, people steal so they can, and commit crimes to obtain money to get drugs, right? So they steal, they do break and enters, they break into cars, you get, sex work, selling drugs, all as a way to fuel drug habits. And this is largely driven by accounts and an understanding that after we get into the 1960s, the types of substances that, the economic system that we're in, and then the types of substances that start to be available are increasingly potent and powerful and compel people into these particular patterns, right? And we get these in kind of waves. Probably the most significant ones and the biggest shifts are shifts to things like crack cocaine in the 1970s and 80s. Can't rate dates for some reason, 70s and 80s. And then things like, amphetamines. I'm just gonna write speed because I can't remember how to write amphetamines. Speed in the 1990s. Cocaine as well, heroin a little bit, but then, not 1900s. My pen randomly died. Strange. Speed in the 1990s, and then meth, which is an amphetamine as well, in the late 90s and into the 2000s. And then, of course, in the 2010s forward, we have fentanyl being the kind of key substance, right? And that people basically, as these drugs come into the market, they're more and more addictive, and so there's more and more compunction to purchase. And that's been the kind of general framework that people, treat. It's like a lot of crime is basically out of the economic compulsion to get, to buy drugs, to keep drug habits going. Brunel et al., in 2000 sort of pushes back against this. The adolescents, because they're relatively, young people, probably aren't as involved in this other than a small segment of them who are already deeply involved in organized crime, because the kind of drugs that adolescents tend to favor, tends to be less expensive drugs. So it's probably not as strong a factor as it's sometimes painted to be, right? In terms of like things like crack, cocaine, speed, meth, these are not the drugs that young people typically consume. Most young people are consuming, typically not the case as much in Canada anymore because it's legal. Marijuana. Marijuana is bad. Okay, sorry, that's me pretending I'm a teacher on South Park. Marijuana, and then MDM, or ecstasy, or Molly, or whatever you want to call it. Right, these are the drugs most typically consumed by young people is marijuana and ecstasy, and they tend to be some of the cheaper drugs out there as well. So economic powerlessness probably pushes them in that direction, which means they're not as compelled to consume crimes. The other one, I should say, the other drug that young people are most likely to consume are pills, particularly painkillers that they stole from their parents. All right, so you should always dispose of your drugs properly, because someone's always looking to steal them. I think I saw an episode of The Simpsons where Marge finds all of Homer's old pain pills from all of his injuries and starts selling them at a garage sale, and basically becomes a drug pusher, which, kind of how it goes. All right, and then Brochu in 2013, basically young people, he says, are the least likely to explain offending as being caused by the need to obtain drugs because of dependency. This is something that happens mostly when you get into the range of 22 to 30, according to Brochu. That's our key age range where people find it economically compelled, usually because they've become addicted to hard substances in that time. But our sort of, teenagers and early emerging adults are the least likely to say this. So maybe, but, youth crime also seems to be driven by, recklessness, risk tolerance, and just the fact, and impulsiveness are the key kind of factors in youth crime, typically. Impulsiveness being a big one, which is why, a lot of the psychology research today says that untreated ADHD is one of the leading causes of youth crime, simply because it leads to impulsiveness, which tends to lead to, committing kind of silly crimes in the moment because you're not thinking. Okay. Some of the places where young people can be criminalized for their involvement in drugs is things like possession. That's the most common one. Less common is selling drugs. Far less common is producing drugs. And far, far, far less common, right, is trafficking drugs. Really, when we talk about these last two, those are only your young people who are involved in organized crime that tend to get into this. Drug offenses on the whole, especially for young people, because they mostly kind of sit here in possession. I don't know, maybe I'll highlight. I haven't highlighted anything in a while. Because they sit kind of in possession and selling, we typically only see, drug offenses for young people happening as a result of proactive police work. Because these are victimless crimes, the police have to sort of try to catch them. Otherwise, it tends to go under the radar. Right, so proactive policing is, enforcement activities police initiated rather than responses for calls for service, right? So police have to kind of find you. And sometimes, one of the things that happens with young people is they will be targeted by proactive enforcement, because the assumption by police is that they can put pressure on a young person and get them to, turn over their supplier of drugs, as you would a bigger fish. So they'll pressure young people to try and move up the chain, and then, give them something like in Canada, an extrajudicial measure or extrajudicial sentence. Okay, man, when I taught youth crime and society, the phrase extrajudicial measure and extrajudicial sentence, you say it like a million times, and it will continue to bother me that, having taught it for 4 years, I still cannot say them without tripping over the words. Every time. I don't know what it is. Extrajudicial. It's like the extra to j. I don't know. I can't do it. Okay. Yeah, am I back on my pen? No, my pen. The YCJA has encouraged police to divert youth involved in drug offenses towards extrajudicial measures. I have to really concentrate, and I can do it. Specifically because, right, they typically sit at this level, the relatively low level of possessing and selling drugs. Okay. Yeah, so possession offenses are the most common drug offenses. And yeah, official rates of possession represent only a tiny, tiny fraction of the actual offenses committed. Again, because it's not like, in most places in Canada in particular, we don't have laws like stop and frisk or, stop, question, and frisk. So police can't just search you without cause. So there's likely people running around all the time with drugs on their person that aren't being stopped. And it's only, under certain circumstances that you will get stopped for possession of drugs. You have to be a little unlucky, and the police have to have probable cause. Some reason you're acting squirrely that would give them a chance to search you or, say, your vehicle. Any kind of substance use, right, whether it is alcohol or drugs, is a status offense, right? So it automatically implicates youth in criminal or delinquent behavior because status offenses are still part of the youth criminal justice system in Canada, right? So just having drugs or taking drugs or alcohol are in fact status offenses in Canada. The other one, that tends to get people, possession of any kind of controlled substance, often is accompanied by other rule-breaking or deviant behavior. If you're buying, say, alcohol or marijuana in Canada and you're underage, it can involve the use of fake IDs, theft, or hiring bootleggers. I actually never realized until recently, like the last 5 years, that hiring someone to bootleg for you was actually a crime, which is funny because for reasons having to do with where my birthday falls in the year, I was like the first person in my graduating class to turn 18. And I had a car. And so my Friday and Saturday nights in high school were extremely busy. And I also had a cell phone. So I had this magic combination in the 1990s. It was 2001. I had this magic combination of I had a car, I had, valid ID, and I had a cell phone. And so my Friday and Saturday nights of my senior year in high school were basically spent driving alcohol around to my classmates who were all underage and partying. And I actually paid for like my first 2 years of university by bootlegging, which is a terrible thing to admit, but I made a lot of money driving my Suzuki Swift around full of beer, which was super fun. I got pulled over a ton, and they're like, "Where are you taking this?" I'm like, "Home. It's gonna go in my garage. Just, me buying $500 worth of alcohol tonight for no reason." And it's like, as long as they don't catch you delivering it, apparently it's not a problem. Anyway, don't do that. That's a terrible idea. And it is apparently a crime. I didn't even know. I'm like, whatever. They paid me to buy them alcohol. Why would that be a problem? I'm of legal age. This is why 15 to 22-year-old men get into trouble, because you're impulsive and stupid and you don't understand the law. I, however, was spared this because I was lucky and, I don't know, talked my way out of a bunch of stuff with police. So that's all good. But yes, hiring bootleggers. Don't do that if you're underage, because it's bad. None of you are underage anymore, so it doesn't matter. But yes, that was my life. And I got to pay for a lot of university bootlegging to my senior class in high school. Okay. All right, selling drugs. Can you imagine, right, in 2001, having a cell phone was a weird thing, and I was rather unique. I think only like out of my 300-person graduating class, only like 40 of us had cell phones. What a strange and different world you live in. All right, selling drugs. Majority of youth who use drugs have bought them from people they know, right? Drug sales tend to go through these informal networks. And yeah, it's mostly dependent on peer connections, and historically has largely been limited to cannabis. Although with cannabis in Canada being legalized, it's spread out, and things like pain pills and ecstasy are now pretty common as kind of recreational drugs. Dealing in hard drugs or dealing outside your peer group, we really only see in habitual offenders and street-involved youth who are often addicted themselves and are selling, basically to support themselves. Okay, I think this is my last slide. We're going to end 11 minutes early, and I'm not going to apologize for it. Okay, youth. when we talk about like really, really serious drug crime, it almost only happens when people have become involved in organized crime, right? In terms of producing drugs, most young people lack the skills or capital to do so. So they typically, you know, participate with adults, sometimes work on their own or with other young people um, in producing and trafficking drugs on a large scale. What most typically happens when we're talking about drug sales is you have like organized crime, and most often in looks like a non-smiley faced organized crime. The most common one in Canada is the Hells Angels. It took me a really long time to figure out that all of my colleagues who go into prisons all the time, they just call them HA, and it took me forever to figure out what the hell HA was. But if you ever hear a criminologist talking about HA, they're talking about the Hells Angels. Weirdly, they're all friends with Hells Angels too, which is a little trippy. So Hells Angels, which then typically deal to like street level gangs that are usually youth oriented, right? In Alberta, this would be indigenous gangs like Red Alert. There's just a few other ones. I just can't remember what they are. Some ethnically based gangs, for the most part, they deal with the actual like distribution, recruiting of vulnerable youth, and then they kind of pass it down to dealers, in schools and communities, which then kind of actually deal the drugs, right? So most of the production, and trafficking happens at these levels, right? And again, typically the trafficking will happen. Organized crime groups like the Hells Angels will subcontract that out to street level gangs, usually that are youth oriented, and let them take the heat for it. They use youth to sell their drugs to peers, work as kind of sitters, right, kind of guarding drugs or laborers in drug production, and increasingly, things like the Mexican cartels will use young people to smuggle substances across borders. Most of our young people who are involved in the drug industry themselves are drug users, right? So it's not your average young person who who deals in drugs, which is why a very typical, extrajudicial measure will involve rehab, right? It's really common in Canada now. If you get caught dealing drugs, you're not going to get sent to prison, but you are going to get sent to rehab to treat that drug habit. Okay, I'm done. That is crime. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, so next time on Monday, we are going to start one of our last 2 units. We're going to talk about mental health. I know no one can see what I'm doing now. We're going to talk about mental health on Monday, get some interesting stuff on mental health. And then our last unit is going to be on technology. So we're going to do full circle, right? We started with a technology in the printing press. We're going to end in a technology, smartphones and social media. It'll be fun. We'll see you on Monday. I'll have your exams back. And we'll end out the course with those topics. So have a great weekend. On Wednesday, I said, always seems weird, but have a great weekend. Turn off the live stream so people aren't watching black for 3